What is the value of a video game? $60? $70? Do you wait for sales? How does somebody justify a monetary amount for a piece of media or art, and how is the justification of that cost different for each individual experience? This is an essay about value. When the Resident Evil 3 remake was released, the smell of criticism was pungent in the air. I saw a lot of disappointment revolving around features and sections cut from the original title, a lack of content within the game, and a general feeling of disappointment. I understood many of the gripes. They were fair. I agreed with many myself. The game was announced soon after the Resident Evil 2 remake arrived, and since that title was incredibly well received, expectations were high as the release date approached. The turnaround between the two games seemed so fast, like we had barely had enough time to fully explore what Resident Evil 2's remake had to offer, and a new title was coming in hot. That being said, the thought of a remake of one of the series' most memorable entries was certainly enticing. When I finally got my hands on it, I played it through 3 times back to back. I thought a lot about what was presented and how I felt about it. I shared in much of the disappointment fans felt, but after some contemplation, I thought there was one thing about this particular remake that was excellent. Something that stood out as a notable improvement in comparison to the rest of the franchise's entries, and that was its handling of character and story. Once again, spoilers from here on out. The first question you're probably wondering is, Clark, why did you skip Resident Evil 2? Don't worry, we'll get there one day. I write essays when I feel the focus of what I'm trying to say is sharp, and when it comes to Resident Evil 2, talking about what makes both the original and remake versions so special is a heavy lift. That's not to say I don't have anything to say yet. I just need some time to continue to refine my thoughts into something I believe is worth saying. I also like to tackle things that challenge me, so that's how I ended up here. Here's a quick disclaimer. For those of you who were disappointed by this entry, and I know I picked a divisive one, before you run to the comments section and talk about how terrible you think the game is or dislike this video, just know that I'm not planning on debating whether the game met all of the standards fans desire. I think we can agree that it didn't. I want to say this loud and clear, I am not defending cut content. I want to approach it from a different perspective. That's why I write these essays. I want to talk about the value of particular content. Let's look at it from a different lens than just solely gameplay and in-game features, and explore the strength of the narrative. Let's examine whether or not it can still be a satisfying piece of art for a specific audience. This is not a review. This is not an essay meant to rip apart what didn't work, but rather to focus on what did and why. If you run to the comments talking about how disappointed you are in cut content, you're wasting your time. But for those of you who were left unfulfilled by this entry, we're going to talk about why that might have been too, as well as how that fits into a player's experience. So, why did I feel it necessary to jump in the timeline to the remake of the third entry? Well, on this channel, story is king. Without story, decisions are meaningless. That's not to say a player can't derive joy from challenge and excitement. They can. This is a video game after all. However, if a narrative is introduced, then the value of a piece of art can be explored through that narrative. If it can't, then a video game would have more in common with a carnival game than a yarn well spun. I think they're a little bit of both. The wonderful thing about art is there are no right answers. I hope my last video got you asking questions. That's why I made it. I'm not necessarily trying to convince you of something, trying to encourage curiosity because I'm curious. Through your thoughtful comments and feedback, you certainly got me thinking still deeper about a piece of art I love so much. Let's talk about Resident Evil 3's approach to storytelling, but with a caveat. I'm going to try to limit myself to only the remake. Despite some references to the original Resident Evil 3, Nemesis, and only to illustrate certain points, comparisons will be limited. I think the Resident Evil 3 remake has value that stems from its handling of character, rather than content. I know, that's a hot take, but if you enjoyed my previous video, then stick around for my reasoning. Remember, action is character, and I think that's no more true than in Resident Evil 3. Again, I'm not debating whether or not Resident Evil 3 was disappointing in aspects, but I do think it features a good story well told. I chose to move forward to Resident Evil 3 because in my previous essay, I made the argument that the characters in the original Resident Evil game were a little flat, but the same is not true for this title. Okay, that was a really long intro, I know, but I felt like I had to be clear about my intentions. I don't want the focus of this essay to be misconstrued. So let's switch the format up a little bit here. I'd like to try to keep it fresh. How should we approach Resident Evil 3? Let's start with its stars. See what I did there? You know what I heard little criticism about during Resident Evil 3's release? The characters. Good storytelling is reliant upon character. When we think about the stories we love, we may enjoy the gameplay, plots, genres, or aesthetics of them, but it's the characters that stick with us. We see ourselves in them, and maybe, if we're lucky, them in ourselves. We want to relate to characters, and I'm not talking about their occupations or skills. That's a common misconception about relating, but rather their dilemmas, opportunities, and decisions. I don't need to be a STARS member or have any special tactical response training to have a moral compass. We relate to the characters of this franchise because we want them to learn, to grow, and ultimately to save the day, and that's because we imagine ourselves fulfilling the same destiny, even if it's just managing to make a grocery list, fight the crowd, and make dinner. Video games are unique in this way because we get to be an active participant in the characters' stories, even if a tight narrative allows for limited choice. I talked a lot about the characters of the original Resident Evil in my previous video. I made the argument that the narrative is plot over character, and that's fine, because we fill in the character blanks through our own investigations. But what about when the characters are fleshed out and motivated? What about when they have conflicts and flaws that keep them interesting? It is here that the meat of storytelling lies, and Resident Evil 3 very much embraces that, not only through its main character, Jill, but also through some of its supporting cast. I might be so bold as to say this is one of the best presentations of beloved characters the franchise has to offer, and I'm not talking about character models and designs, though those are great as well. Why do I say that? Because the decisions the characters make in moments of great conflict are weighty and purposeful. The strength of the narrative on display here is derived from Jill's personal fears and the relationship between she and Carlos. Jill's character has been developed considerably. How so? Certainly through her setup, but so too through the events that she endures during the course of the narrative. Not just once, but several times, it is Jill who makes a decision that changes the course of the story, not the player. How do we know they're interesting choices? Because when she makes them, she crosses the threshold into the point of no return. Her choices put her at risk. They have consequences. That's good storytelling. If the strength of a character's action is based on the severity of its potential consequences, then the writing on display here is the kind that prioritizes Jill being a character of action. Not the genre, but her agency. So what about Carlos? Just like Jill, Carlos's decisions affect the plot, and this makes him a great addition to the narrative by filling the role of supporting character. Carlos is given the proper character moments that we expect from good stories, and where he starts at the beginning of the story is different than where he finishes. Once again, survival is a major priority for the characters. Survival is a prerequisite for any Resident Evil game, old or new. Remember, I never debated that the genre of Resident Evil is or is not survival horror. I just tried to focus in on the story and ask whether or not there's more going on beneath the surface. Like the original game, Jill and Carlos both share the same desires: survive and escape. This time, though, there's some more elements added in that help to thicken the plot a bit. Unlike Jill and Chris in the original game, Jill and Carlos are characters with unique identities that affect the plot in interesting ways. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Together, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. On the surface level, Jill and Carlos have a playful relationship, but dig deeper and you'll find characters that learn to like, and more importantly, trust each other. It's dynamic. Jill and Carlos need to earn each other's trust, and the strength of the narrative is derived from this relationship. Unlike the original Resident Evil, there is good character arcs started and finished here. Jill's arc sees her learning to trust someone who is seemingly working for the enemy. Carlos's arc sees him developing a conscience and becoming autonomous. It's tested further in the finale. Want me to elaborate more? Don't worry, we'll get to structure soon enough. What about our villains? Let's talk about the star of the show first, Nemesis. This is hands down one of the most creative enemies the team at Capcom has dreamed up, whether it be his original portrayal or his remake version. Does he remind you of any other famous villains who relentlessly stalk their prey? He has a lot in common with the Terminator, which makes him one of the most memorable villains of the franchise. But it's not just his strengths and weapons that make the Nemesis a terrifying foe, it's his personality and tenacity. Most of the monsters a player is forced to encounter in the franchise are single-minded, devoid of thinking and reasoning because they have succumbed to some virus or parasite. And Nemesis has too, but there is the sliver of personality inside him. It's well defined. After all, isn't that Umbrella's ultimate goal? Create the perfect weapon that can obey orders? Perhaps it's his resilience, his relentless pursuit of the heroes that gives him that extra little bit of flavor that has made him such a fan favorite. Zombies wander, but the Nemesis hunts. His ability to problem solve and use complex weapons make him have more in common with a character like the Predator. He has one goal and one goal only: hunt his target, no matter the personal cost. Notice that in a game I argue features characters at the forefront of the narrative, even the monster has personality. It's the tyrant, upgraded. The same, but new. Don't believe me? Consider that the Nemesis speaks. It has only one word in its vocabulary: stars. And that ties directly to our hero. It makes the relationship between him and Jill personal. Good heroes and villains can be opposite sides of the coin, and that's true here. Jill wants to stop Umbrella. The Nemesis works to enforce its goals. And Nemesis isn't the only antagonist thwarting Jill and Carlos's escape. They'll also have to contend with Nikolai. We talked a lot about Blake Snyder's Save the Cat book in my last video. I never really explained what the title even meant. In a nutshell, saving the cat means having the main character do something honorable or admirable that makes us enjoy them, like saving a cat. It gets us on their side early in the story. So, what is the opposite of saving the cat? Kicking the dog, and Nikolai does just this when he kills his partner without hesitation. We can relate to good villains though, and so we enjoy when a villain is right. He kills his teammate not because he's evil, but because it's necessary. Jill is rightfully mad when he takes this action, but it's one that she probably might have had to take herself if the time came. Is he a terrible person or a pragmatist? We'll find out soon enough. Nikolai is an effective character. His motivation is simple: greed. He's a lot like Wesker. Even his allegiances become questionable at the end of the story. This is something we can all understand, something we could all easily fall victim to. He reflects the greater whole of the Resident Evil story, whose villains often succumb to greed without considering the effects it has on the innocent bystanders around them. Umbrella itself is symbolic of greed. Maximize profits, no matter the human cost. In storytelling, there's a lot of discussion about characters being likable, and often that's confused with being heroic or honorable. Characters who are good or do the right thing all the time are pretty far from the truth and pretty vanilla. It's not like the real world. It couldn't be more far from the truth. What story experts really mean when they say likable is interesting. Think about some of your favorite villains. Are they likable people? Would you have a coffee or beer with them? Probably not. But they're intriguing, and that's why they're likable. Wesker is a perfect example. Why is he so beloved? He's the villain. Well, he's traditionally cool, powerful, conniving, and mysterious. In other words, likable. The Nemesis, though villainous, is likable. Darth Vader is likable. Revolver Ocelot is likable. Hell, Hannibal Lecter is likable, even if he's a terrible person. He's fun to watch, and that's key to character. And Resident Evil 3's characters don't just shine in their traits and personalities. The level of care in the design on display here is incredible. It really goes far to making us believe these characters are real. Look at these models. If I made the claim that Resident Evil didn't translate neatly to film, I'd have a tough time arguing that the aesthetics of film don't translate neatly to video game visuals. If this isn't a moment a video game looks like a movie, I don't know what is. Never mind epic set pieces or cinematic camera movements. Notice the subtle expression. It's the stuff film is made of, the slightest hint of emotion, the visual cue that tells us so much about the character. But the polish doesn't end with the visuals, because with great-looking characters comes the demand for equally great voice acting. We all know that Resident Evil has struggled in this department in the past, and though it has been weak at times, many of us have become endeared to it as a characteristic we associate with the franchise. Those days are gone. The talent here is off the charts. With every cylinder firing in the character department, where does Resident Evil 3 fit into the ever-changing genre of the franchise? The answer is in the characters. Have you ever seen a buddy cop film? This is a genre of storytelling in which two characters, usually very different than each other and sometimes law enforcement professionals, have to come together and put aside their differences to stop a crime or perhaps a common enemy. Over the course of the story, they typically find their conflicting personalities aligning to learn about each other, achieve a common goal, and perhaps grow to like each other. Think 48 Hours, Lethal Weapon, Bad Boys, or Rush Hour. Now, I'm not saying that Resident Evil 3 falls neatly into the buddy cop subgenre of storytelling. Resident Evil 3, like its predecessors, is many genres, most predominantly action horror. The mystery element of prior games is not at the forefront here. Don't believe me? Consider what happens when one inspects this box. The game told me what was intriguing about it with barely a prompt. By the way, remember what I said about the original Resident Evil subgenre? Resident Evil 3 is not demanding that you inspect it or investigate it. Instead, it's training you to survive and stay on the move right from the opening moments. There is a ton of forward momentum and minimal backtracking. In fact, the game asks you to backtrack less and less as you move through the plot. Backtracking is confined to small subsections and areas that almost act as mini-maps. The original gameplay's geography is replaced with a new map that is certainly more linear. The game also begs you to learn and understand the dodge mechanic. This emphasizes the elements of both survival horror and a chase narrative. Running out of ammo? You'd better get good at dodging. Play the game on Nightmare or Inferno mode and the game is commanding you to learn the dodge mechanic. The A-plot of Resident Evil 3 feels like a chase story first and foremost, a race against time. Even the smaller moments are powered by the thrill of the chase, most often because the Nemesis is on Jill's tail and, for unexperienced players, fighting him is ill-advised. The first encounters where Jill can fight him are terrifying and overwhelming. They're supposed to be. When those first handful of bullets don't take him down, the player is encouraged to make a run for it. Navigating other enemies while the Nemesis pursues you just adds to the thrilling tone of the game. If Resident Evil excelled in the dread department, then Resident Evil 3 soars in the thrill of escape. I bet if I wore a blood pressure cuff while I played the game, my levels would rise anytime Nemesis leaps onto the screen. Even later in the plot, when the threat of a missile strike is announced, the game takes the chase elements and amps them up considerably. Now you're running from enemies and the demolition of the city. It's a race against the clock. Resident Evil 3 feels like it has more in common with a movie like Speed. You slow down, you die. Even the zombie mechanics have been upgraded, and their ability to lurch great distances and seemingly sprint after you force the player to keep their thumb glued forward on the keyboard or analog stick. The only times the game generally asks you to slow down is when it forces you to confront the Nemesis in battle arena style settings, and even then Jill's speed is no match for his. The dodge mechanic comes in handy here. The Nemesis is fast, but Jill is crafty. So if the surface level plot is about escape, and that strongly suggests an action horror plot, what about some of the supporting genre elements? It is here where the characters truly shine, in these moments where we get to catch our breath and learn about who they are. Even though the chase is what gives the narrative its thrust, I would argue that Jill and Carlos's relationship takes its cues from some of the tropes of the buddy cop structure, and that's what supports the B-plot. What tropes of the buddy cop genre does the plot hit? Here are some. Two individuals that imagine working together to be preposterous. A cop who is disbanded or forced to turn in their credentials. A case that is dangerous to pursue but doing it anyway. How about a deeper conspiracy? One cop nearly dead and saved by the other. One cop saves the other from a villain at the last second. Explosions. The list goes on. Those are just some examples. Carlos might not be a cop, but under martial law he's recruited to save citizens in Raccoon, so he functions in a similar way. Consider Die Hard with a Vengeance. Samuel L. Jackson is not a cop, but he's forced into fulfilling the role of one. Let's go back to that action horror A-plot and think about the music. Even the music in Resident Evil 3 supports the chase and action horror genres. Notice how the music rides the plot. When there's forward momentum, the music emphasizes it and it helps separate the major movements of the game like a symphony. Anytime we're forced to slow down and explore character, the music does too. Anytime we're given a goal or task or forced into a new environment, there's a tonal shift within the music that invigorates the player to get on the move again. The days of music cues being based around locations have been revamped to suit the movement of the story, and this works well within this entry in particular. In some of the original titles, the absence of music can be disturbing in and of itself, but here, like any good action narrative, it only helps to amplify the tension as it builds. When the story wants you to move, it tells you to do so sonically. So, how do the characters and genre fit into the overall narrative, and how does the structure support them? Oh no, here we go again. But check it out, we're going to approach structure a little bit differently this time. I love structure, and I just find story mechanics so fascinating. Aren't you just happy it's not an essay on vaccine synthesis? This video is about character, so we're focusing on that, but let's just see how the character's actions play out within the structure. I mentioned that the original Resident Evil took inspiration from cinema, and I compared its plot to that of a popular Hollywood structure. Resident Evil 3 feels even more cinematically structured, so let's use a traditional film template again. We're going to be turning to a different master of storytelling this time for structural guidance, Mr. Sid Field and his legendary book, Screenplay. This is required reading for filmmakers, and I'd highly recommend reading it. It's a much more stripped down version of structure than our previous advisor, Blake Snyder, and his book, Save the Cat. So instead of saving the cat, we're going to be turning to Field and his structural paradigm. And since we're generally talking structure's use within visual mediums, let's take a look at a graphic that helps us see it before we discuss it. This is a much more simplified version of the traditional 3-act structure. It's not as rigid as Snyder's method, but if you laid both down on top of each other, you'd achieve roughly the same results. Again, I'm no authority on structure, but let me give you one bit of advice if you like discovering structure as much as I do. Don't get too bogged down in it. It's not mandatory for a good story. There's no rules in storytelling, only techniques. You really only need 3 things to tell a story: a beginning, a middle, and an end. In Sid Field's paradigm, those elements are broken up into the first, second, and third acts, and each has subsections that help to fuel great, tight plots. I'm going to be really upfront about my problems with Resident Evil 3's structure. I think everything happens really fast, and even though it's a tight plot, I think it moves just a little bit too quickly for a video game. Most of the problems occur in the first act, especially how quickly the exposition happens. Like I said in my previous video, horror often starts with a taste of the monster and what they're capable of. What should we and our heroes fear? Here, we get a little bit of world building in the form of the state of Raccoon City. It's Bedlam. We are told about a rampant virus and citywide martial law. This is quick exposition, and it's fine, but what really amps up the stakes is the glimpse of our antagonist, the mighty Nemesis. This is a good opening scene, but I don't think it's the opening scene proper. That goes to the first several minutes of gameplay in Jill's apartment. So let's just consider this a little bit of setup, world building, and villain introduction. The opening scene here is a really cool one. It's one of my favorite of the series, and that's because it's character focused. We start by seeing what Jill's been up to since we last left her. This is effective for both returning players and new players. Remember what I said the original Resident Evil was about? I think I made a good argument about investigation. Well, now Jill's committed to that investigation. The stars are fractured and the team disbanded. This portion serves as a little bit of catch-up for returning players, and it's certainly needed since the prior entry, Resident Evil 2, had a narrative that focused on separate characters. What really matters in this sequence, though, is not this exposition. There's something better. Jill has a nightmare that she's been infected. It lets us know her fears right off the bat, and what characters are scared of is a great motivator of character action. It's personal. It reminds us of the stakes. If Jill sticks around, she could herself become one of the undead. After she wakes up, we get a snapshot of what her world really looks like. Notice the color palettes used in these 2 sequences. The first is cool and dreary, the second warm and vibrant. They contrast each other. The dream world is the worst case scenario. So let's talk about the inciting incident. If you're watching this channel because you discovered my previous video, let's see if you can guess what this one is. What event kicks off the plot? This one's pretty easy, right? If you guessed the arrival of the Nemesis, you'd be right. Brad tells Jill she needs to get out of Raccoon City, and the sequence is interrupted by the creature. It's simple and effective, even if a little premature on a story level, and the monster's arrival will affect the rest of the story as it unfolds. This inciting incident is personal to Jill. It's character specific, and this type of plot beat should be. We probably could have learned a little more about Jill's character, but this is a sequel, so too much exposition would slow down the pace. It kicks the plot into high gear without any hesitation and turns the first act into a bit of a chase story that gets the adrenaline pumping. I like it, with some reservations, and I think many other players do too. It plays out a little differently in the original, and so does Brad's involvement. In the original, Brad is killed by the Nemesis in a stronger plot moment, but in this version, I think it ties the villain to Jill a bit better. Brad will get his character moment later, and it will involve another returning character that, despite small amounts of screen time in the franchise overall, gets a moment to shine and inform the plot of another entry in the series that players have likely played. Jill sees rescue in the form of a helicopter, but it's quickly destroyed by the monster on our backs. Escape has vanished before our eyes. After an incredible fall, we're made aware of just how durable this new threat is. We get a more proper introduction to the Nemesis, as well as a look at its face. Is this a reasoning, thinking being? With no options left in sight, Jill attempts a retreat. Just when things are looking grim, Jill is narrowly rescued from the clutches of this creature. It's been stopped, but for how long? As Jill pivots from her original escape route, she is introduced to Carlos, an Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service Operative, or UBCS for short. Their relationship starts off rocky, with Carlos assuming she's incapable of caring for herself. Jill learns of Carlos's mission and is enraged by what she discovers. Notice there's genuine character emotion here. The buddy cop elements start in earnest. Right now, Jill is focused on escape, and working with an Umbrella operative seems like a disaster waiting to happen. This is when one of the themes is first challenged, and it's all about trust. We meet Mikhail, and in truth, he doesn't seem all that bad. He's totally down with bringing Jill on board, perhaps even intrigued by her history. The team's intentions to evacuate citizens via subway seem pure, but Jill couldn't possibly be sure of that, and, jaded by her previous mission, who could blame her? A common goal unites Jill with the team, and that takes form in the first major plot moment. Remember, a plot point should send the story spiraling in another direction, maybe challenge characters and put them in some type of danger or upside down world. Jill makes a choice, it doesn't just happen to her, and that's an effective character action. Jill won't be escaping anytime soon. She'll need to head back into the disaster to assist the team and take the first steps toward proving herself to both them and Carlos. This serves as a great moment of debate. Jill now has to work with the enemy. Can these two, Jill and Carlos, work together? If we can get the train moving, we can evacuate both ourselves and the survivors. The motivation is strong here, especially for Jill, and she has to do it with her enemies no less. She makes that decision, not the player. Her relationship with Carlos here is playful and antagonistic and serves their plotline well. We hope they'll be able to make it work for the sake of surviving. As Jill navigates Raccoon City, she's forced to do so among all manner of monsters, including the Nemesis. It's a total fun and games moment. She also has her first proper introduction to Nikolai, and it helps to enforce the debate elements. Is he representative of the UBCS team? If so, then she's working with cold, heartless operatives. What has Jill gotten herself into? But uh-oh, remember, the Nemesis doesn't quit. Guns won't stop this menace, and Jill knows it. The functions of pinch points are hotly debated, but in essence they need to escalate drama around characters. A pinch is a moment or sequence in which the characters must face down a major problem, and it can be a sequence or make up the larger issues of the first and second halves of the second act. The pinch makes up the bulk of the Raccoon City adventure. With the power back on and escape in sight, Jill endures another attack by the Nemesis as she treks through the city. When she finally gets a moment of respite, she reconvenes with the UBCS team. Notice the foreshadowing here. Nikolai warns Carlos, "She'll get you killed." Little do we know that this prediction has the chance to come to fruition later, and it's by Nikolai's hand no less. The pinch extends into another important character moment. Jill shuts the gate to stop the Nemesis from accessing the rest of the survivors. To draw him toward the train will only put the citizens at risk, and since the problem is Jill's, she'll have to contend with him herself. Again, this is a moment that doesn't just happen to Jill, she makes a choice that will directly affect her relationship with Carlos, work toward their development, and jeopardize her safety. There's no going back. It's a selfless act, and one that sees her taking responsibility for the situation. It's also another step toward influencing Carlos's ability to trust her. She proves her capability yet again, but also prolongs her own escape. Jill is forced to manage still more terrible foes in the form of the Hunter Gamma creatures, and they'll test her abilities while the Nemesis is at bay. Navigating the sewers is brief, and when she finally resurfaces, we get a very prolonged pinch point in the form of several more encounters with the fearsome Nemesis. Jill will have to best him not only on the rooftop as he pursues her with a flamethrower only Umbrella could love, but also on the street level as he hunts her down with a rocket launcher. Carlos comes to the rescue, and this is another moment in which Carlos endears himself to Jill. If pinch points develop character arcs, then Jill has taken a step in a new direction, and so has Carlos. Perhaps she doesn't have Carlos pegged after all. The characters are consistently front and center and actively change the story. Back at the subway car, we're told Nikolai is untrustworthy via some exposition provided by Mikhail, further enforcing the idea that not everyone on the team is trustworthy. In the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, the midpoint takes place in the courtyard of the clock tower section, but it's moved up here. Jill finally makes it to the train, and we see the seeds of acceptance blossoming between she and Carlos. This smile says it all. Escape is in sight, but has Jill developed some concern for Carlos's safety when he's ordered to remain behind? Like any good midpoint, characters usually encounter a minor victory, a false victory, or more defeat. The remake versions is long but effective. In this case, the victory is ultimately false. What was a method of escape ends in disaster when the Nemesis returns. Nikolai, representative of everything Jill feels is untrustworthy about Umbrella, leaves Jill for dead. Mikhail, who was seemingly an enemy at the start, sacrifices himself in order to protect Jill. It's also a wonderful little foreshadowing as to how Carlos will behave later, as sacrifice is something Jill doesn't equate with these operatives. The UBCS boys are not so bad after all, but when it comes to Nikolai, all of Jill's fears regarding these mercenaries come true. The subway derails, and Jill has made little forward momentum toward achieving her goal. Carlos's adventure takes a turn as well because he won't be escaping anytime soon. The plan has changed. He'll have to go looking for the only man left alive with knowledge of the vaccine, Dr. Bard. We also get an interesting character moment between Brad and Marvin, which helps to further inform the events of Resident Evil 2. It's yet another reminder that the threat is very real. There were once people behind the eyes of these monsters. Tyrell assists Carlos with this new endeavor, and through that relationship we feel Carlos's first bit of hesitation regarding his mission. It's a big step toward him thinking for himself, becoming independent in his actions. He's questioning his motives. Carlos will have to navigate the police station if he's going to figure out how to find Dr. Bard. A call from Jill causes a shift in his priorities though, and we'll get back to that soon. Now, we have a sort of dual narrative going on here. It messes with the timing a little bit, but that's okay because the game does a good job of explaining what transpires when through radio communication. Sometimes around the midpoint, protagonists are forced to face down their antagonist, and often they reach a point of no return. When we finally regain control of Jill, the midpoint extends a bit to feature an inevitable major battle between herself and her enemy. The fight in the courtyard with the Nemesis couldn't be more perfect. Jill finally takes it down after a heated assault and assumes she defeats it. Usually, a hero fails to defeat their enemy at the midpoint, so this victory is also false and short-lived. Think about sports movies when a team or player is defeated by their opponent early on. It's there to remind us the odds they're up against and feels all the better when they finally defeat them later in the finale. Unfortunately, the point of no return comes when her worst fear is realized. That nasty Nemesis has one more trick up its sleeve, and it infects her with its barbed tentacle. Luckily, Carlos has temporarily abandoned his orders and went looking for Jill. He cares about her, even though it's in direct contrast with his company's wishes. They've sent the Nemesis to kill her and the remaining STARS members, and here Carlos is working to protect her. It's excellent conflict. We regain control of Carlos again in the hospital. With Jill infected and nearing death, it's up to Carlos to save her. Notice how Carlos's position of obtaining Dr. Bard, something he's uneasy about doing, shifts and coincides with getting Jill the vaccine. The two plot threads meet, and that's just damn good storytelling. We see Carlos's hesitance to be an automaton that does Umbrella's bidding. He's questioning reasoning, something Guns for Hire shouldn't do. Is he looking for Dr. Bard for Umbrella, or trying to save Jill? Maybe a little bit of both. Navigating the hospital won't be easy though. The hunters are back and better than ever. I'm not typically going to discuss design details in these essays, but damn does the hunter look great. Their fighting form is also at its finest. They're fun to fight, even if a little cheap. Carlos finds Dr. Bard dead and also learns the truth of Umbrella's devious nature. Bard has been murdered and Umbrella's board voted to make it happen, along with wiping out any information that connects them to the horrors that befell Raccoon City. If Carlos hasn't doubted himself or his employer yet, he certainly does now. As far as pinch points go in regards to character development, Carlos is taking another step toward independence. Like any good pinch, just when the characters thought they've got victory in their grasp, the narrative throws another problem at them. With the vaccine in hand, Carlos reconvenes with Tyrell. A missile strike is imminent, and worse still, a mob of zombies threatens their temporary position of safety. Carlos is forced to defend the fort, and depending on the difficulty the player has chosen, this can be seemingly impossible. But Carlos is a damn good mercenary, and he's successful. When Jill awakes, we're treated to a glimpse of her fears again, but this time with a twist. She sees Carlos as the one at risk of infection. Has she developed feelings for him, as well as a fear of what she might have to do in a worst-case scenario? She's already lived out her own fears and survived, because of his efforts no less, so it's another wonderful character moment that is personal to Jill. The threat of infection still haunts her, even if the target has changed. To make matters worse, Jill hears of the impending missile strike on Raccoon City. Both Jill and Carlos's second pinch points work well here. If characters start stories believing lies, then Jill's lie is that everyone at Umbrella is evil, and that has changed. If Carlos believes the lie that Umbrella has sent him to do good, honest work, then his stance has changed as well. Both characters choose to do something about it, and that springs them from the second plot point and into the third act. Jill learns that it was Carlos who protected her when it counted, a surprising bit of information for someone who wasn't sure whether or not this man could be trusted. Tyrell informs Jill that if a vaccine can be procured, the missile strike could be called off, and if that isn't a break into 3, I don't know what is. It's do or die and turns the third act into a race against the clock much in the way the first act was chase-focused. It provides good momentum. Jill makes her way into the underground to track down both Carlos and more vaccines. A missile is incoming, so Jill could escape, but instead she chooses to return to the lion's den. Raccoon and Carlos are worth trying to save. Someone she was once not so sure about has undoubtedly earned her respect. As Jill discovers a lab beneath the hospital, when doesn't Umbrella have a secret lab on standby, she must retrieve another vaccine. Nikolai attempts to thwart her yet again, and if the Nemesis wasn't bad enough, we have to deal with a threat the Resident Evil franchise is so famous for: human monsters. Tyrell is killed by the Nemesis, which serves as a reminder of just how dangerous he really is. After braving even more of Umbrella's horrible creations, Jill manages to make the vaccine, but as with any thrilling story, victories are short-lived. The Nemesis attacks, and though Jill escapes, she's forced to deal with Nikolai once more. He makes a dastardly pitch for her survival and runs off with the vaccine. This battle, regardless of many players' frustrations, is a wonderful example of gameplay meeting character, plot, structure, and genre. Not only will Jill have to defeat the Nemesis, but she and Carlos will have to work together to do it. They've come full circle. Now two people who were not sure if they could trust each other have nothing but trust, and they'll have to use it if they are going to survive. With some teamwork, they seemingly do. But false endings are the stuff of great action and horror stories, and the Nemesis fills this plot mechanic perfectly. The final confrontation is a fun one here. Jill has been chased down by the Nemesis since the beginning. This time she's not running. She's going to stay and fight, kill it or die trying. When Jill meets Nemesis in the pit, she's forced to, but when she confronts him again here, she makes the decision to. Jill says, "I've got this," and Carlos says, "I know you do." It's a great contrast from his opening line. She entrusts him with the more important job, stop Nikolai. And Jill does what we hope she will. She gives Nemi the finger. Usually in the third act, protagonists must consider the themes of the story thus far, and working with Carlos and confronting Nikolai does just that. If one of the themes of Resident Evil 3 is trust, then it's on full display here. Carlos makes a sacrifice. He tells Jill to take the shot, even if it means risking his own life. Because of the information he uncovered earlier, he knows what the priority is here, not his own life, but stopping Nikolai and letting Jill live to see another day. It's very effective because Carlos has changed as a character right before our eyes. So has Jill. Her hesitation to pull the trigger evidences her care for Carlos's life, even if stopping Nikolai is the priority. Remember when I said the original Resident Evil's plot wasn't character-driven? Well, here Resident Evil 3's is, and I believe it comes from these character moments. This time around, you are Jill. What does she want and need in this entry? Well, she wants to make her final escape, but she needs to work with the enemy if she's going to succeed. This is also an interesting exploration of the franchise's themes, because just like Wesker before him, Nikolai is a traitor to his own team and employer. He destroys the vaccine as a final act, meaning that Raccoon City's fate has been sealed. Jill takes the shot and stops Nikolai, and does so without injuring Carlos. This is Jill Valentine after all. And just like my prior point about the theme of the original Resident Evil, consider Jill's last line to Nikolai. She makes a statement about detective work. She's committed to it. Maybe Raccoon City will be destroyed, but at least as far as this subplot is concerned, today greed doesn't win. A tragic but fitting end to a trilogy. Okay, I apologize if I didn't cover every little nuance in the story, but I can get a little out of control with these structure sections even though I enjoy them very much. Is there anything weak about the plot? Well, that's certainly subjective to the individual player, but one thing that stands out to me is the timeline. It's lengthy and feels a bit inconsistent that a long stretch of time passes off screen, especially for a short story. I don't know that it was necessary in the first place. If the narrative needed to evidence a halted virus in Jill, they could have done so with a visual cue and saved the long gap. Virus incubation periods have always been a little inconsistent in the franchise anyway. It feels strange, like the plot wants to both keep momentum but is also forced to slow down to accommodate the story. The helicopter moment might have been the better moment to kill off Brad. The developers could have introduced him earlier, then introduced the Nemesis in this moment as well. It would have roughly lined up with the original sequence of events. The characters have safety in their grasp, so take it away here. It would hurt far more. This might have been the better place for the inciting incident, and it would have allowed some room for the expansion of the first act. Meeting the Umbrella operatives could have come a bit later, and I bet fans and critics wouldn't have felt so disappointed with the breakneck intro. I'm also not so hot on the idea of a missile strike. I'll admit this plot moment does seem a little far-fetched. I've always found this to be an improbable plot moment in the overall franchise, but maybe that's because I can't picture it in the real world. Then again, there is some sense to it because how else do you stop the spread of a massive viral infection? There would be no one simple way. I also think it's a little weak because the odds that the infection would have spread beyond Raccoon City before the strike are really high. Even if the city was closed off, plenty of people that were unknowingly infected would have spread the contagion across the globe in short time. Having said that, if Umbrella's got elected officials in their pocket, anything's possible. So, how does the structure affect the plot? Well, I talked a lot about how the original Resident Evil didn't translate well to film because of the player's actions and participation. Resident Evil 3 has a different narrative altogether, one that gives you little if any choice, but commits to a story well told, at least as far as gaming narratives go. A lot of the elements I mentioned are also featured in the original game, but in the remake, the same moments are presented with more care and craft. The dialogue feels natural and purposeful, and the emotions true. The polish is there, even if streamlined. Resident Evil 3 has a sharpened story. The thrill of the chase forces the characters to start working together because if they can't, they're doomed. The momentum forces a relationship, even if there's resistance from the start. Do you know what I find fascinating? If I reframe Resident Evil 3 in my mind, whether it be the remake or the original, as the official sequel to the first game, meaning a continuation of Joel's story and the second act of a metaphorical trilogy, I like it even better. It hits a lot of those second story in a trilogy beats, but I won't go into them. Do you know why? Because there would be no fitting third story to give Joel closure to a trilogy. Unlike the original Resident Evil, the characters drive this story. The pace is quick, and that means the overall game is too. And that brings us to content. There is a lot of debate around content in gaming. How much content does the game ship with? How much is there to do in the game world? How much replayability is there? If you saw my first video, Resident Evil Nothing Is As It Seems, then you know my focus in gaming revolves around story. This is certainly Resident Evil's most simple, stripped-down story out of the main franchise entries. It's reflected in its structure. Whereas the original Resident Evil had a complex plot filled with a myriad of twists and turns, the format of Resident Evil 3 does not involve the mystery elements that often comprise those types of stories. With that comes an emphasis on the content that narratives often do focus on, mainly character. So, does that mean the content isn't there? Well, that depends on what content means to you. Maybe you like more enemies or areas to explore. Maybe you like alternate costumes and unlockables. Maybe you like puzzles. You may not, and that's cool. Again, we all absorb different things from art. That's what's so wonderful about it. What about length? I did an experiment before I made this video, and I played both the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and the remake twice each from start to finish. I've played both many times in the past. You know what I found? The original took me roughly 5 hours and 54 minutes to play through on easy. The remake took me about 4 hours and 52 minutes on normal. The original on hard took me about 7 hours and 44 minutes. And the remake on hardcore took me about 4 hours and 24 minutes. In terms of overall playtime, they're certainly different. Then again, everybody plays video games at different speeds, just like we read books at different speeds. So, what's missing? If we compare Resident Evil 3 to its original version, of course there is content missing. I would never debate that. But let's ask the question, what kind of content? Well, for starters, the initial map is incredibly small compared to its prior version. I'll never forget the feeling of opening up the Raccoon City map for the first time and being in awe of the possibilities of exploration within the city. This is certainly not the case for the remake. The remake ushers you through a very small bit of geography quickly, even if efficiently. There's little left to the imagination. But then again, the original is a little meandering. It wants to keep some of the investigation elements from the first entry, but considering Joel's priority is to escape, she seems awfully busy dilly-dallying around the city. Overall, the remake's experience does feel thin. Ammo crafting is reduced if not gone entirely, and that's certainly disappointing. I also find the Hunter Gammas a little uninspired. The first time you meet them, they catch you off guard, but on every subsequent playthrough, they're easily dispatched. Let's talk about one of the most divisive cuts from the remake version of the game, the clock tower. When the remake came out, many, including myself, were disappointed with the absence of this once iconic section. I've thought about it a bit and reframed my perspective on it as time has passed. In storytelling, there's often a rule that one should cut the fat. This means that anything that doesn't move the story forward or help inform it should be removed. If you're a Stephen King fan, and I am, he stresses to kill your darlings in his book On Writing. What does he mean by that? Well, he's talking about getting rid of things from the story that don't serve it in any important way. Look at the clock tower map from the original game. Is there really that much real estate here that it needed to be included? Then again, it's kind of small, so did it need to be excluded? We may never know. I think perhaps the developers thought the clock tower was a darling, and furthermore wasn't serving the story. Think about it this way. The major focus of the clock tower was to give Jill a goal for escape and ultimately a low point for her character. It gave the audience a false sense of hope when that helicopter arrived. Then the Nemesis arrives to ruin the fun. It also allowed the player to utilize Carlos for a brief time. That's it. Yes, there's puzzles and battles and events, but ask yourself how they serve the story. I know, the remake is frustrating in that it gives players a pamphlet that almost seems to promise them they'll go there, and in the original, it's introduced early as a sort of beacon for escape. You could argue that the assault on the helicopter by Nemesis provides a bit of a false ending, and that's true, but in essence, the same plot beats happen. In the remake, Jill still suffers an injury and infection by Nemesis, and the same events roughly play out over the course of the hospital section. Carlos still gets his hospital adventure to retrieve a vaccine. In fact, the new narrative ties it in with the story further via the introduction of Dr. Bard. It achieves the same goal. The remake version even has more thrust behind it, because those nightmares Jill is experiencing happen again, this time to someone she is beginning to trust. It's a callback and a wonderful character moment. She cares for Carlos and fears what she might have to do in a terrible situation. Essentially, these story and character moments were consolidated, the fat trimmed, and the execution may be more effective. Carlos has motivation to protect Jill because of a blossoming relationship, and that works far better. What about the park sequence? Cut as well, but again, I want you to truly consider what it added to the original game on a story level. It was filler, decent filler, but filler nonetheless. Sure, one could argue that the discovery of files that provide more exposition are story elements, but the same general information is revealed in the remake. Is the Gravedigger really essential to the relationships explored through the characters in the game, or is it just a cool recurring boss battle that gives the player another challenge? It's the latter, even if I do miss it myself. I've also seen some disappointment over the absence of the live choices, but to be fair, those live choices often left players with the illusion of choice rather than actual choice. The live choices essentially put players right back on the same path in short time. What does bother me about their absence is the lack of any drops by the Nemesis. There was reward for braving a battle with him, and that system is severely reduced if not feeling like it's gone entirely. The live choices give players some options that the original Resident Evil did not, and that keeps replays exciting and unique. But on a structural level, I want you to consider what they changed that actually affects the outcome of the story. Despite meeting people in different locations, alternative deaths of supporting characters, and perhaps new, but small, locations, the main plot doesn't change. I know the Riverbridge live selection does give players the option to see what many consider to be the canon ending, but it feels like more of a tacked-on Easter egg than a concrete resolution, and a convenient one at that. What about the behavior of the Nemesis? Well, the same fear he instilled in players in the original game have certainly been quelled a bit. The linearity of the remake still sees a scary foe, but not in the same way he was presented in the original. In his cutscenes in the remake specifically, he doesn't ever go for the kill like we'd imagine him to. In the original, he is attempting to kill you at any opportunity you run into him, and you can feel it. With the quickened pace of this entry, at times I did feel like I was watching Resident Evil 3 rather than playing it. This feels the most evident in the first 30 minutes of the game. The game is teaching you how to play it, but only in short bursts that are peppered with cutscenes or QuickTime events. These first handful of scenes are the most frustrating on a gameplay level, and probably the moments in which most gamers started to realize something was amiss. I'm just as miffed by all of these absences as you probably are, and they definitely left me feeling a bit empty in terms of what I'd expected. A remake should remain faithful to all the things that work about the original. Drop what doesn't, enhance what does, and add surprises. I can think of a no more perfect example than the Resident Evil remake. Resident Evil 3's remake does not do that. I feel like it's missing magic, except in the story department. I like seeing a story commit to the decisions that the characters make, at least as far as Resident Evil is concerned. There are many video game franchises that allow players to explore their choices and desires, especially in the fantasy genre. Have you ever played Mass Effect or Fable? I don't believe Resident Evil is one of those franchises. As I said earlier, in this sense, Resident Evil 3 has a lot in common with traditional narrative structure. The developers committed to a story, even if short. Now, I know you're probably wondering why I haven't touched on the Mercenaries minigame yet. I have a bias here, and I'm okay admitting it. Here it goes. The Mercenaries isn't what brings me to the table. Sure, it's fun, but I don't associate my draw to Resident Evil with its challenge minigames. Many players do, and that's really cool. I watch people play it. I admire their skill. Having said that, I am not a challenge player. With the exception of some knife-only runs, it's just not my skill set, and so though I enjoy it, it's not the thing that keeps me coming back to the franchise. I understand people's disappointment with its absence, but from a story perspective, it's not going to taint my experience. That being said, it does seem strange that something players love so much wasn't included. What was the reasoning? Are there any improvements? That depends on who you ask. I think the quick dodge system has been vastly improved over the original, and it's genuinely fun to use, especially when dealing with the Nemesis. It's a mechanic that suits the chase and survival style of the story well, and a gameplay element that does double duty for the narrative. As far as content goes, I can't list everything. This is not a review or takedown piece, so I just tried to focus on some of the major issues. So maybe we can agree that Resident Evil 3 does succeed as a narrative improvement, but not as a remake overall. The absence of the mercenaries probably frustrates players who equally want challenge content with their narrative content. I've seen some criticisms about Jill's character in relation to the original game, but I made the argument that Jill really didn't have much of a character to start with. The same can be said for the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Did she really have that fleshed out of a character in the original? I'm not so sure she did. My biggest problem with Jill in this entry is some of her dialogue around the Nemesis. It's inconsistent with the fears she's supposed to be feeling around the character at times, but again, character is action, not just speech, costume, or aesthetics. I know this scene in particular bothered a lot of players, but let's be honest about the suspension of disbelief one is supposed to apply when playing these games. The horror elements beg the viewer to consider a little bit of fantasy within the franchise, and they always have. If one nitpicks every fantastical detail about games like these, we'd run the risk of being left with something that feels a bit boring. Resident Evil has always been asking you to check some of your logic at the door, whether it be in its classics, its sequels, or its remakes. Remember when we were supposed to accept that Richard survived this wound? How about when the Tyrant, an organic being, crashed through what is probably unbelievably thick concrete? I've also seen a lot of criticism regarding the lack of puzzles in this game, but in the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, they always felt a little bit forced. Why do all these public places have puzzles? Are we supposed to believe the citizens of Raccoon City have to jump through these hoops every time they want to take a stroll? Resident Evil 3, whether the original or the remake, does not feature the same mystery plot elements the original does, so why force puzzles into a story that doesn't justify them? To appease fans who like the focus of the original game? Well, then in that case, perhaps the original logic of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis should have been scrapped altogether. Puzzles are great if they're organic, not so much if they're out of place. Story is what gets me to open up my wallet in the first place. If you're looking for discussions about controls, gameplay mechanics, graphical capabilities, or sound quality, my goal with this channel is to consider those within the framework of story. I consider those aspects and their effect on the overall narrative. This is a video game, but they are not the sole purpose of video games that promise story as part of their pitch. To finally dissect those topics are not where my strengths lie, and I'm okay with that. I like to listen to other people talk about them probably just as much as you might. I like to watch speed and challenge runs, even if I don't often attempt them myself. So, does Resident Evil 3 feel rushed? Not in its polish, but perhaps in its delivery of an experience that satisfies all of its fans. In that way, I think we can all agree that the final product feels lacking in certain departments. What matters are what types of content are most important to you. We all receive something of value differently from various types of art, and video games are certainly art. As I said before, I think some of the value of a piece of art can be found through the delivery of its narrative. Photos have stories, films have stories, hell, even commercials have a beginning, middle, and end. What I'm concerned with is how I feel while it unfolds, my investment, my excitement, and my concern for even fictional characters and their predicaments. I think Resident Evil 3 delivers on a level many video games do not, even if some believe it fails to deliver on levels many video games do. The next time somebody says, "I enjoyed Resident Evil 3, instead of asking them, how, consider asking them, why? Value is completely subjective. If you didn't enjoy playing the game, you might not consider that it has any value, but some players will find value in areas that other players don't. Let's do some quick math. I hate math, so let's try to make it as painless as possible. How much do you pay to go to a movie? $10, $10.50, $11? When I would go to the movies in Manhattan, sometimes I was paying $17.50. For simplicity's sake, let's say $15 for a 2-hour experience. You're gonna want popcorn or a soda, right? I need red vines. I know, it's weird. Let's assume that a movie gives us 2 hours of entertainment. Entertainment that, other than the experience, we don't get to keep. We don't walk out with the physical media of the film after we've finished, just a good, bad, or unremarkable experience. Hopefully it makes you feel something. How much do you pay for a video game? $60 is the average, right? I paid $60. For that price, I got to not only keep the product, but also continue to replay it, whenever I wanted to. I played through the game 3 times initially, once on normal difficulty, a second time on hardcore difficulty, and a third time on nightmare. There's also an Inferno difficulty, but we're not going to talk about that. Some people bought Resident Evil 3 during a sale, so maybe they only paid $19.99, not much more than the price of an average movie ticket. My point is, for $60 you get to keep the game. You get to have this experience forever. If a game takes 6 to 8 hours to play through, and my original playthrough was just that, then at $60 the math kind of works out. Even if I only played the game once. I've played it through now about 10 times, which means I paid roughly $6 per playthrough, and the more I play it, the cheaper it gets. Maybe that's a personal way of looking at it because for some players value lies in the content, but I think what we consider content varies from person to person. If you didn't like the game, your feeling of having wasted money is fair. When a remake is announced, the inevitable question always comes up: what do you want to see from it? I was looking for an updated version of Resident Evil 3, and I don't mean just graphically. I wanted to see the developers reimagine this property to feel updated, more lifelike, more believable. Video games have evolved a lot over the years, and with them the craftsmanship not only of player experience, but of character, story, plot, and genre. I know that many of my viewers will debate the value of a game by assessing its playability. A video game can be judged on how often it keeps the player coming back, how enthralled they are with the user experience. In that regard, I've probably gotten the most value out of Halo multiplayer or Skyrim. Perhaps even the developers recognize this lack of value for certain players. I often see the game on sale, usually packaged with Resident Evil 2's remake. Of course we don't want a mediocre gameplay experience, I'm with you there. Why would I care about discovering a story if the method in which I unfold it is boring, frustrating, or punishing? I wouldn't care, so in that way, the gameplay is important. This is a valid point, especially since this is the main focus of the medium, but I would argue again that everyone absorbs something different from a piece of art. When you listen to a piece of music, do you like to belt out the lyrics because you can relate to them? Or do you like to nod your head because you can feel the beat in your chest? Both ways of enjoying the medium are acceptable. I just happen to prioritize story. If progressing through that story has my hands doing gymnastics on a controller or a mouse and keyboard, all the better. Resident Evil 3 presents many of the thrills and fun players generally expect, but this time it does it with a stronger narrative experience. Often I'm left feeling a sense of emptiness when I finish a video game because I didn't think the story was anything spectacular, even if the gameplay was exceptional. My hands could be dripping with sweat, my fingers cramped from gripping the controller, but the thrill is stronger if I'm emotionally invested in the story and characters. It's why I haven't returned to so many games over the years, but kept returning to few. Again, if you were disappointed in the delivery of Resident Evil 3, that is totally okay. In many ways, I was too. I'm just asking you to consider that substance is different for every individual, and what a player looks for within their content can lead to unique experiences for all that pick up a controller. With the remake of Resident Evil 4 set to arrive in less than 3 months, I'm keeping my expectations tempered. The developers would do well to learn from the reception of Resident Evil 3, especially considering the original Resident Evil 4 seemingly features both one of the longest campaigns and the most robust offering of content. For the game to be a hit, it might only need to succeed in the major places the third did not. Then again, I'd argue its story could use some polishing as well. We'll know soon enough. Remember when I said the original Resident Evil was plot over character? Well, guess what? Resident Evil 3 is character over plot. The franchise's characters have never shined so brightly, even if the box they've been packaged in doesn't contain all the content players expected. For me, Resident Evil 3 is a lovely disappointment. If character is substance and substance is content, then I think I got my money's worth in the story department. If you didn't like Resident Evil 3's remake, I didn't write this essay to try to make you change your mind. I wrote it to ask you to consider another perspective. I started this essay by asking the question, what is the value of a video game? But I'll leave you with this question. What is the value of a good story? If you like this video, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Share it with your friends, Resident Evil fans, or people who just like storytelling. I'm really thrilled about the positive response I got on the last video, and very much appreciative to those who found it enjoyable. Even if you didn't, I still appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed this one. Sequels are hard. Just ask Resident Evil. Be nice to each other in the comments. Thanks for watching.